Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Ashok. This video is the part of LWC hands-on tutorial series where I'll be creating multiple videos which will help you to learn LWC practically. And today in this video we will see how to pass data from HTML file to JavaScript controller, or we can say how to read HTML controls values in JavaScript file. And this is a must-know thing for every LWC developer before proceed to coding. So in this video we will learn multiple approaches and we'll discuss which one should be used when and which is the better approach. Okay, so let's start today's video and directly jump into VS Code. So now I'm in my VS Code and here I already have created a new project and authorized with my org. So now let's create new component and name it anything like register demo. Alright, component has been created. Now let's open HTML file and write some basic HTML. Okay, so I have added one lightning card and under this card I have added one div to add some horizontal padding, and under this div I have added one lightning input which is for first name and also added one submit button. Okay, so here I'm assuming that you know basic about LWC, like what is LWC, how to get started with it, and how to create project and component, and how to authorize to org. And if you are completely new and don't know about these things, then you can refer my LWC Crash Course part 1 in which I have explained these things in detail, and you can find link for that video in description. Okay, now let's say we are done with our HTML part and now we want to access this first name text box value in JavaScript file to save somewhere or for anything. So LWC doesn't support two-way binding. Two-way binding means whenever we do changes in JS property, that should be automatically reflect or sync with HTML, and if we change the value in HTML, that should be automatically reflected in JS file. So here in LWC, only one-way binding is working from JS to HTML. Like if we change value of a property in JS, then that will be automatically reflected on HTML. But HTML to JS is not a built-in feature. We have to write extra code for that. So let's see this thing in practical. So let me open my JS file and create a property for first name. And assign any value like test. Now let's bind this property with input control. Value first name. Okay, so this is how we can bind any primitive data type in HTML template. Now what we have done here, we have bind our first name JS property with first name input control with the value attribute. So whatever value we have in the first name property, that should be visible in this text box, and if we change value in this text box, that should be updated in this first name property again, right? So to verify this, let's create a submit button click handler and print first name property value. Okay, so I have created a on-click handler and printing first name in console. So now to test this component, we have two ways. First, we can deploy it on Salesforce, and we can use it on Salesforce pages like on home page, app page, or record page. Or if you don't want to deploy it and test it locally, then we can locally preview it using local development server. So let's preview this component locally using local development server. So let's right click on this component and select this preview component locally option and select use desktop browser. And this is also I have explained in that Crash Course video. So if you don't know about what is local development server and how you can install it in your system and how you can start it, then you can refer that video. Okay, so now you can see that component here locally without any deployment to Salesforce. And now you can see by default we have test value in this first name text box, Why? Because we have defined test in first name property and bind that property with text box. So it means one-way binding is working, from JavaScript to HTML. Now let's make some changes in this text box value and click on submit button. Now if you'll see in the console, still it is printing test, but we have value demo, right? So it simply means whatever changes we made on UI in HTML controls value, that doesn't reflect back in JS properties. So that's why we can say LWC doesn't support two-way binding. So I think now you are clear that what I meant by two-way binding and what kind of binding LWC supports. Okay. So as we have seen, JS to HTML is a built-in functionality, but HTML to JS is not working there. So for that, we have to write some custom logics. So now let's see how we can read HTML controls value in JavaScript file. So let's start with first and pretty basic approach, that is using event handlers. So in this approach, what we used to do, we add event listener with HTML control and bind event handler with that. And at last we create that event handler method in JavaScript file. Then we can easily access control value there. So let's see this approach in practical. So let's say we want to access this first name control value in JavaScript file. So let's add onChange event handler with this control and bind event handler method name. So let's write first name change handler and create this method in JavaScript file. Okay, so what we have done here, first step is we have added this onChange event listener and added this event handler method name here, and finally we have created this method in JavaScript file. Now whenever we will change value in this text box, then DOM will call this event handler method. So program will directly come here, and this event parameter is the object of current event, which contains all the details about this event, like what is the type of this event, who is the target element, and what is the position of mouse. And it contains lots of other informations as well about event. And now if you want to get element value here, then first we need to get the element, and that we can find in event.target property. So let me write code here. So this target property will contain our current element, this text box. And now if you want to read this text box value, then we have to add here dot value. Okay, so this is how we can read controls value in JavaScript file using event handlers. Now let's save and preview this component in local development server. Okay, so by default we can see the value test, and let's change it to something else, demo, and click on submit button, and let's open inspect. All right, now you can see demo here. Now let's change something else and click on submit again. Okay, now you can see new value here. It means this first name property contains updated value of element now. Okay, so this is how we can read HTML controls values in JavaScript using event handlers. And this approach is simple and good if we have few controls. But let's say we have a large form, and in that we have lots of controls, around you can say 100. Then do you think we should go with this approach? Because here we are creating event handler with every control, and if we will go with this approach, then we have to create 100 event handlers. Then I think this is not a good idea or approach in this case, because if we are going to create 100 event handlers for each control, then our code will be messy and very lengthy, right? So in such kind of situations, our next approach can work, that is generic event handler. It means we can create a generic or common event handler for all the controls, and in JS file we can write some logics to assign value in correct property. So let's see this approach in practical. And before that, let's create few more HTML controls. So let's say as of now we have 3 input controls, first name, last name and phone. Okay, And now if you want to access these controls values in JS file, then as per previous approach, we have to create 3 different event handlers like first name change handler, last name change handler, and phone change handler, right? But now we will see how we can do it using single event handler. So let's create new event handler method. And bind this with controls. Okay, now we have bind same event handler method with all these 3 input controls. It means this same method will get called when we change value of any control like first name, last name, and phone. And in JS side, let's say we have 3 properties here. So now here the question is, how we will get to know in which property we should assign the value? Because now same method is getting called from all these 3 controls, right? So in this case, what we have to do here in JS method, we need to identify who is the originator of this event call. Like, is it called by first name or last name or phone? And how we can do that? By reading some attributes of target element. And as we have discussed, in this event.target, we can get the actual element reference due to that this method called. So using this event.target property, we can read any attribute of element like label, title, and value. And if you can see here with these controls, we have assigned unique label to all these controls. So we can use this label as an identifier here. But this is not a good choice because label is something that we can see on UI. And if required in future, then we may need to change this label. So in that case, we need to make changes in JS code as well, right? So that's why we should not use label as an identifier. So as a good approach, what we can do, we can add data attributes with HTML controls. And what are data attributes? Data attributes are nothing, just we can say custom attributes. And you know, with every HTML tag, we have some standard attributes like ID, name, value, and title. All these are standard attributes. But if you want to add some additional details with controls to use later on, then you can add them as a data attributes. Okay. So let's add data attributes with these controls. Okay. So I have added data prop name attribute with all these controls. And with data hyphen, you can add any custom attribute name here. So I wanted to define property name here. So I have used prop hyphen name in kebab case. Now let's see in JS file how we can read these data attributes. So as we can see here, standard attributes can be directly accessible. Like to access value, we can directly add dot value. But if you want to read data attributes, then those are available under dataset property. So let me write code, then I will explain to you. Okay, so I have added here event.target.dataset.prop name. So this target property will contain actual element reference, and this dataset property will contain all the available data attributes on control in camel case. You can see here in HTML, we have added attribute in kebab case, but in dataset property, we can access it in camel case without data. Like this data prop name can be accessed as prop name. Okay. And now in this prop name variable, we have attribute value of caller element. So we can use this as an identifier. So let's assign the value in respective property. And here we can use if else condition or switch statement. So now here let's use switch statement and assign value in respective property. So first let me hold this value in another variable. Okay, so I have added a switch statement and assigned value in first name property if property name is first name, and assigned in last name property if property name is last name, and same in phone. Okay, now we will have these controls values in properties. So let's print these values on submit button to verify. Okay, now let's say in local development server, here should be some padding horizontally. So here should be P instead of S. Let's check it now. Yes, now we can see some space, and let's write some values here. And let's click on submit and open inspect. Alright, now we can see all entered values in console. It means JS properties are updated with element values. Okay, so this is how we can create and use generic event handler with multiple controls. Now we can say this approach is better than previous one if we have multiple controls, because here we don't need to create multiple handler methods, but here we have to create multiple properties to hold value of every control, and need to add cases in switch statement for every control. So if we talk about lots of controls, then we will have lots of properties and condition in switch statement, right? Now to eliminate this problem, what we can do, we can create an object and hold all these controls values in that, and these multiple properties are not required in that case. So let me comment these properties and create new object property. Let's say form data. Okay, now let's assign controls value in this form data object. So let me make a copy of this method and let's comment it. Okay, so that's only the required code. So what I've done here, I have removed switch statement from here and assigning control value in this property of object. So if you will see here, initially we have declared object blank, and now let's say we have entered something in first name, then this method will call and will get prop name as first name. So what it will do, it will add new property first name and assign control value in that, and same thing will happen with last name and phone. So dynamically these properties will added or updated in this object. Okay, and now let's make changes on this button click handler. And first name property is referenced here, so let's remove it because we have commented, and here also, so let's comment it and also console this whole object. Now we are done with changes, so let's preview this in local development server and enter some values here. Alright, now we can see controls values here. It means control values are properly get assigned in object, and if you will see this object here, then we have all these properties, first name, last name and phone. So all these properties dynamically get added in that object. Okay, so this approach is more convenient and generic because here we don't have to create multiple properties and we can dynamically update object properties and values, right? So if you have a situation where you have to hold multiple control values or multiple properties, then you can use this approach and you can hold them into single object. Okay, now if we talk about code, then this is simple single line of code. So this approach is the better than previous because here we can hold values of n number of controls without declaring separate properties, and code is also less and simple. Okay, but here we are adding event listener with every control. So whenever we change the value in any control, then it will call JS method, and if we have lots of events registered in component, then it will make our DOM heavy and we may face performance issues. And you know, in our case we require values on submit button click, so there is no sense to have event listener with every control. But if there is a requirement to have, for example, you want to add some validation on control value change, then it's fine. You can add change event and perform your validation. But now in our case, we are not doing anything. We are just assigning value in this form data object and using that value in this submit button click handler. Then why can't we read these values in this submit button click handler only, right? So let's remove these onChange event listeners from controls and try to read those values here in this onClick handler. Okay, so I have removed onChange listener from these controls. Now let's see how we can read these elements in JavaScript. So to search component elements in JavaScript, we can use DOM methods like querySelector or querySelectorAll. So let's use querySelector method and let's write this .template.querySelector. Now here we want to find elements from current component. So we use this .template here. Now in this querySelector method, we need to provide selector for the element, and selector can be element ID, CSS class or any attribute. I mean querySelector support all the CSS selectors. So let me use this data prop name attribute, and attribute name should be passed in a square bracket. Okay, so querySelector returns first matching DOM element. In our case, it will return first name element, and to get value, we can write .value here. And let's add this in form data object and assign in first name property. And let's also write for last name and phone. Okay, so this is how we can find component element using querySelector, and we can assign values in object. But here with querySelector, we need to get elements one by one. But let's say we want to have some generic approach and we don't want to get each element one by one. Then we can use querySelectorAll. What it will do? It will return list of matching elements. So let's use this method to make this code generic and assign values in this form data object. Okay, I have passed only attribute name here. Now it will return all the elements which have this data prop name attribute. And here I am iterating this returned elements list and reading and assigning value in the form data object. Okay, and now let's remove these lines from here. Now let's preview this component in local development server. Alright, you can see values of all the controls here. It means this approach is also working fine. And we have seen how we can access HTML elements in JavaScript file using querySelector or querySelectorAll DOM methods. And after getting the reference of element, we can easily read and assign the values. Okay. So if you don't want to add event listener with every element, then you can use this approach. Okay. But in Sprint 23 release, Salesforce introduced new and better way to access component elements without DOM methods like querySelector or querySelectorAll. In Sprint 23 release, Salesforce introduced new ref keyword. So using that, we can achieve this requirement more easily. So let me use ref attribute to read controls values in JS file. So with HTML elements, we can use ref attribute with unique value like LWC :ref and assign unique value. So let me add first name and add same ref attribute with all these other elements. Okay, so I have added ref attribute with all controls. Now if you want to access HTML elements in JS which are having ref attribute, then you can find them into refs object. For example, let's say you want to access this first name text box, then you can write like this refs attribute value, that is first name, Okay, so this will return as first name element, and if we want to get value, then we can just write dot value. Okay, so we can say refs is the dynamic object which contains reference of all the component elements which has ref attribute, and we can add this ref attribute with any kind of HTML element like text box, button, drop down, and even with child components as well. Okay, now let's write some code to read and assign values in form data object. Okay, so what I have done here, I'm iterating all the properties of refs object using for loop and reading and assigning values into form data object. Okay, now let's comment this query selector code and also remove this data attribute. And now let's preview this component. Okay, so we are getting error here, invalid directive LWC ref. So this is because ref attribute is the part of latest release, so maybe local development server doesn't support it as of now. So let's deploy this component to salesforce org and see there. And before deployment, let's make some changes in meta config file so we can use this component in salesforce pages. Now I have exposed this component and added home page and app page in targets. So let's deploy it to org. Deployment is done. So let's use this component here on home page. So let's edit this page and add component. Component added. So click on save and bake. Alright, now we can see our component on home page. So let's enter some values and open console. Okay, so we can see all the controls values here. So it means we have successfully accessed HTML elements using ref attribute, and as we have seen, this is very easy to use and good in performance as well. So we should try to use this from now. Okay, so I think that's it for this video, in which we have discussed multiple approaches to read HTML control values in JS file. And as a conclusion, from now we should use ref attribute to access controls in JS. Okay, and I'm working on more practical videos on LWC in this series, so you will get them soon. And if this video helped you to learn anything new, then please like and subscribe my YouTube channel so you will get notifications for new videos. Thank you for watching this, and I will see you in next video.